Hi, everyone. So in this video, we are going to be taking a look at the wonderful world of cognitive psychology. And this is a super, super, super important unit. So please, 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 I know I'm not the most exciting speaker all the time, but this is a unit that you really need to be well-versed in and well prepared for the AP Psych exam next week. You can see 13 to 17% of the multiple choice section. So 13 to 17 of the 100 questions will be directly from this unit. And this unit will also probably appear on the FRQ section. It almost always does each year. So it is a unit that is definitely important to really make sure you have a handle on as you are studying for next week. Now, looking at all the subtopics within this unit, I would say that cognition is really the most central of all the subtopics in this unit. It's where most of the questions will likely come from. The other areas, you might see a question here or there, but you're going to definitely see a lot from this cognition. So I'll spend a lot of time on cognition, and then we'll kind of do a quick little dance through the rest of the subtopics here. So again, cognitive psychology sounds scary, sounds frightening, sounds like something mysterious. It's really not, folks. Again, it's this idea of basically looking at how do we think? How do we think? How does our thought processes work? You can see that here in this slide, all right? Now, interestingly enough, psychologists sometimes encourage folks to engage at looking at their own thoughts, right? So having people think about their own thoughts, right? So thinking about thinking, right? That's metacognition, okay? So again, we can look at this, individually, right? We can look at our own thoughts and analyze them too, all right? So when it comes to our thoughts, first thing to be aware of is that our thoughts are very much organized, all right? We're still kind of figuring out how these connections work inside the brain, but we know that there is some sort of organizational system that our brain is utilizing to organize all of these thoughts that you're having. Now, one of the cool things when we look at the organization of our thoughts is all of us have what are called prototypes. And it's this idea of basically having like a really good example for whatever category we might be asked about, right? So I ask you about, tell me about birds, right? What comes to mind? You might say robin, right? And for you, robin is the best example for you of a bird. And still others might say penguin. And for them, penguin is their prototype. It is their best example of a bird that doesn't really fly very well. But anyway, again, I ask about a car, you might say Ford F-150, or you might say Honda Accord. If you say Honda Accord, awesome. I like Honda Accords too. I agree, great prototype. All right, so prototypes are, again, that part of that organizational system that we have in our minds that help us sort of quickly be able to to come to some sort of conclusion quickly, right? Now, when it comes to our thinking, we can either do a whole lot of thinking or a whole little thinking, right? If we do a whole lot of thinking, right, we're coming with a lot of ideas, all right, then we call this divergent thinking. Oftentimes we'll do this when we're trying to be very creative, or we're just trying to brainstorm as many possible ideas for solving a particular issue, right? This is always a great way to sort of start out, especially when you have a really major problem, to really come up with a lot of different ideas. Eventually, though, you do have to, converge or really narrow your ideas down to one, right? Your math teacher only wants one solution, right? So you can't give, 8 different possibilities, right? Only one solution. In psychology, when we were talking about solving issues and stuff, again, it's great that everyone's coming up with 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 ways to solve it. But eventually, at the end of the day, in order for us to practically and realistically solve that problem and address it, we really need to narrow it down much, much further. And that's what convergent thinking is about. So when we're problem solving, we really need to be very mindful about how many solutions we're coming up with, right? Again, it's good to start with a lot, but eventually we do need to start narrowing it down because again, we can't do everything, right? Same thing. You guys are probably doing a lot of this right now as you're thinking about college, right? Again, when you started this whole college journey process, you probably thought about 20, 30 really great schools to be at. And some of you might still be conflicted about, I know I don't want to go there, and I know I don't want to go there, but I really like this school, and I really like this school, right? That's okay. That's a good point to be at, but eventually you will have to converge. You will have to select one, right? Unless you plan on seeking multiple degrees and you're going to go to multiple schools at the same time, and I don't know, you're going to control time in some way, right? So let's talk a little bit more about problem solving, right? So problem solving, there's a lot of ways that we can get to the answers that we get to, right? We can do trial and error, right? So I'm going to use the example of, let's say I get a dining room set from IKEA. For those who don't know, when you buy your dining room set from IKEA, it comes in pieces. Those chairs aren't built either. You got to build those too. So everything has to be put together. Now, how are you going to put together that IKEA dining room set? You could do trial and error, which means that you just start opening all the pieces out of the box and just start randomly seeing what fits with which, right? Sounds like a very stressful experience to me. Again, trial and error is not always sometimes the worst thing, right? If you're really stuck in a situation, it might not be bad to just try every single possibility, right? You might find something along the way. Now, obviously, this is probably the approach we would take with an IKEA dining room set, right? We would pull out that instruction book, right? And we would follow step by step the instructions. We would use essentially what's called an algorithm. It would give us the solution step by step, right? We do this in math. Step by step instructions. That's an algorithm, right? Algorithms are the best of the best when it comes to solving problems because you find the solution as soon as you kind of work your way through each step here, right? The challenge, of course, is that sometimes these algorithms can be quite long and quite, they can be challenging, but the big issue is oftentimes length of time, right? They can take a lot of time in order to sometimes reach the answer, right? And we might also use heuristics as well, too, right? So we might use, for example, a shortcut in order to kind of get to the answer, right? So for example, if I'm at Walmart and I know that all of Walmart workers wear blue vests, right? And I have a question about a product, I might try to track someone down who's wearing a blue vest, all right? Now, I might be right. Could I be wrong? Absolutely, right? I could be wrong. I might not actually get someone who's a Walmart worker. I might get someone who is just, strolling out for the day, enjoying, I guess they like to wear a blue vest, right? Same thing, I'm at a grocery store and I want to go and get some milk. It's in the back of the store. I might immediately head to the back of the store. Again, could I be right? Is it back there? Sure. Might it not also be? Yeah, that's a possibility too, right? Now, of course, when we're talking about shortcuts, we do need to be careful about representative heuristics. These are essentially basically stereotypes, right? So we can fall into that trap of assuming, this older woman must be absolutely nice, right? Because she's an older woman, and that's the stereotype that we've grown up with, right? Or that student is smart because of, their particular race or ethnicity, right? So again, we do need to be careful about when we're using shortcuts about jumping into stereotypes, because again, sometimes these stereotypes may not be great stereotypes, okay? They may not be accurate too, right? They might not be honest. We also have to be careful about the availability heuristic, this idea of things that immediately jump into our mind, right? So we talked about September 11th. We talked about how flying really sort of decreased in the period after that event. Again, why? Because when people thought about flying, they were immediately drawn back to that event, right? It's the first thing that came to their mind. Now, another possible problem-solving method, so you got trial and error, you got algorithm, you got shortcuts, right? Maybe, for example, you're going to use, when you're building your IKEA dining room table and chairs, right? You're going to use some of the things that you remember from the past, right? So you're going to take some shortcuts and stuff, and maybe not necessarily read all of the manual, or maybe you'll immediately say, oh my gosh, I can do this or that. Sometimes you might have an insight, right? Maybe all of a sudden, you all of a sudden just get this powerful idea, this light bulb goes off in your head, and voila. You don't even need to look at the instructions. You literally have the solution to putting together this dining room table and chairs with no problem whatsoever. So that's an insight, all right? And we saw that in Wolfgang Kohler's research that he was doing with chimpanzees. Again, he was noticing how they would just, all of a sudden at one point, they could see them light up and realize, oh my gosh, this is the solution that we're going to use. So when we talk about problem solving, we do have to be aware of some of the challenges that come with it. One challenge can sometimes be a mental set, right? We might approach things from one particular angle all the time, right? We might always use trial and error. And maybe it's not best. Maybe it would be better to use a heuristic, or maybe it might be better to just sit for a few moments. Maybe something pops into our mind. So sometimes we may not necessarily, we may get so trapped into our way of problem solving that we may not be able to approach something from a sort of a newer direction, right? So for example, you've got physicians, right? They are probably going to be utilizing previous cases that they've had, and they may not recognize sort of the unique case that you brought to them in this particular instance. Another issue you might deal with is functional fixedness. When it comes to objects, sometimes we can't see objects being used for more than what they're supposed to be used for, right? Again, we talked about that picnic tarp that covers the ground when you're having a nice picnic outside. And again, when it's raining, you could use that as almost an umbrella, right? Okay, I don't have an umbrella here. I could use this, right? So, sometimes we don't think about that objects could have other uses. Sometimes we struggle with looking for information that supports only our viewpoint, right? That's confirmation bias. So again, not looking for multiple directions, but again, just looking from one angle. Sometimes we have an issue with belief perseverance. So in other words, even when we're presented with really, really good, trustworthy information from the other side, we might just toss it in the garbage, deny it ever existed, because again, we don't want it to interfere with the way that we're thinking about how to solve that problem. Sometimes we're overconfident. You all have probably experienced this at one point or another. Sometimes we get into the hindsight bias. I knew that was the answer. I should have gone with that at first. Sometimes we get stuck with framing, right? So sometimes, we like, for example, what we see here, right? Oh my gosh, I'm going to do this procedure because a lot of people made it through just fine. I'm going to avoid doing this procedure, going with this doctor, because look at this, he lost 10% of his patients. But in the scheme of things, they are saying exactly the same thing. They're just being framed. The wording is just being changed up a tad bit. But again, it's saying exactly the same stuff. And sometimes we get caught up with the anchoring effect, right? So again, sometimes we get so focused on what we're presented with first, right? The very first thing, okay? So we get so stuck on, the average price of a car is $27,000. So we're not ever going to have a conversation with the salesman about making that car that we see on the lot, 18 or 19. We're not going to offer that, right? Because we know the average price is 27. But who knows? Maybe you might be successful, right? Okay. So that's really it when it comes to cognition. Really, again, make sure you study that section really, really well. So the other pieces in this cognition unit, we have language here. So language is kind of just a small piece. So don't get too hung up on, I know that there's a lot of vocabulary attached with this particular subunit, but don't get too caught up with it. You may just want to kind of know a few of the basics here. Again, phonemes are sounds. Morphemes, of course, are the words. All right. And again, remember, you can actually put words together and create bigger words. Isn't that nice? Look at that. And then, of course, grandpa is of course, trying to organize all of this, right? All right, so kind of moving forward here. So that's kind of important, right? So again, make sure you know what phonemes, morphemes are. Again, phonemes, sounds, morphemes, words, right? In terms of language development, be aware of kind of just some of the development, right? So we start with the babbling stage. Again, we're starting with just basic sounds here. All right, from there, we move on to the one-word stage here, then the two-word stage, and then we're in full sentences, right? So just have a basic understanding of that. Again, you don't have to go too crazy or too much more into that. All right. In terms of language development, there's been a lot of theories out there, for example, about how we build so much of our vocabulary and our understanding of language in such a early period of life, right? It's amazing that, by 6, we're, pulling in thousands of words, right? So there's some different theories out there. You, of course, have Skinner's theory. Again, remember, B.F. Skinner was all about operant conditioning. So again, We're talking about rewards here. So, certain phrases that children that are being rewarded with, oh, great job, honey. That's how you say that. Or, oh, we don't say that in this house, right? All of that could potentially play a role in the way that we say certain things. There's also a thought, Noam Chomsky believed that we had basically this language device, which still has not yet been discovered, but Noam says, keep looking, it's there, that basically has all of the different languages of this world. And essentially what we don't use goes away. What we use stays with us. So that's been a theory out there. All right. Again, we talked about in the biological basis unit, be aware of Wernicke's and Broca's area. Wernicke's is what ultimately helps you to understand speech, right? It's in the temporal lobe of your brain. And then Broca's is obviously what allows you to be able to produce the speech, right? If you have issues with either one, then you'll obviously, if you're having issues with your Wernicke's area, you're not going to be able to understand what you're saying or what others are saying. And if you're having issues with Broca's, you're not going to be able to understand, or you're not going to be able to produce that language. Last thing, critical periods. You may just want to be aware of the story of Jeannie. Remember, Jeannie was the young girl who was severely abused. She was basically locked in her room for most of her early life. She didn't really have much contact with her family or really the outside world. And ultimately, she struggled to develop language, right? Even after she was discovered and she was given the best of the best therapy and support, she still struggled with language. And so that shows the importance of the critical period. It shows the importance of the environment on language development, right? So it's not just something biological that is happening within us. It is also something that very much relies on our environment. And really kind of the last big piece with language that we need to be aware of for the AP Psych exam next week is linguistic determinism. Again, this is a strange concept for us because sometimes it's hard for us to step outside and look at how our language influences our particular behaviors, our particular thoughts, but it does, right? So that's what this is basically saying, right? Our language shapes the way that we think. If we don't have a particular word, then, our thought process is entirely different, right? So again, I know that's a weird thing, but you can see some examples here, right? So again, you can see that the Inuit people out in Alaska, they have a lot of different words from snow, right? So they have a very deep connection to snow. To them, it's not just snow, right, on the ground, but to them, there are different versions of snow, right? There are different forms of snow, right? Obviously talked about Jeannie there. Okay, the other big subtopic here is obviously related to intelligence. So intelligence has been a huge debate since the early 20th century here. Binet was really the first to really get this conversation about IQ really started. Now, Binet, of course, had no idea that IQ was going to be abused in so many different ways when he came up with it, right? He just simply wanted to provide teachers in France with a tool to help them understand how to better support their students, right? I'm giving you some data, some information that you can then use to help develop some good supports for your students, right? But of course, it didn't just stay in the classroom, right? We had researchers like Spearman who were coming and actually trying to, investigate, really take a deeper dive into this concept of intelligence. Spearman believed in this G factor, this idea that we all had one sort of general intelligence inside of us, all right? And of course, that was heavily debated, right? So we, of course, get the whole debate that Cattell and Horn bring up in their research that we have fluid and crystallized intelligence. This one's important. Please make sure for Thursday next week you know this because there are always questions asked about this. Again, fluid intelligence is your problem-solving ability, your speed, right? Crystallized intelligence is basically your overall knowledge, right? So again, be aware as you get older, your crystallized intelligence is phenomenal. I mean, you've got a lot of wisdom. I mean, old people have wisdom, right? And it's because of that crystallized intelligence. They've learned, they have experiences. Fluid intelligence, remember, does decrease as we age, right? We become a little bit slower. We have a little bit more difficulty problem solving. So keep in mind, age issues related to memory is oftentimes kind of related more to fluid intelligence rather than crystallized. So it's not that senior citizens lack the information. They have it, right? The problem is that oftentimes their processing speeds is a little bit slower. So kind of another theory. So we looked at Spearman, we looked at Catel's theory, you've got Gardner's theory. Again, you won't necessarily need to know every single one of these intelligence, but Gardner was very optimistic that all of us have different intelligences, right? Some of us are music smart, some of us are more logic smart, some of us are more in tune with nature. So there's a lot of different intelligences that we have. All right, so he was kind of very optimistic, maybe a little too much for some researchers. Again, some people say this system is absolutely unbelievably difficult to follow, right? And it keeps growing, right? We keep getting more and more intelligence. Gardner just keeps developing. They keep going on forever and ever, right? You had Sternberg, who just had 3 in his model, right? So again, you had your street smarts, then you had like basically your crystallized intelligence, right? And then you had your creativity. So again, a lot of different explanations for intelligence, right? And there was, of course, some researchers who, of course, said, okay, sure, all of that's true. But what about emotional intelligence, being able to connect with others, right? So again, lots and lots of theories. Obviously, the most important for you guys to know is going to be Catel's crystallized and fluid intelligence. That's key. All right, so moving forward here, again, the Flynn effect is sometimes appeared against the idea that for whatever reason, we're becoming more intelligent as time keeps going on. IQ scores keep going up. So I guess that's a good thing. All righty. So when it comes to IQ testing, moving here. Again, when we're doing different kinds of tests, whether they're IQ tests or any kind of test, we want to think about, we use a lot of tests in the world of psychology, right? Oftentimes when people are coming in with an issue to their clinician, oftentimes there is a test that is being utilized to help diagnose that patient, right? There might be another test that's then later used to sort of track how the patient is doing overall with their treatment, right? And when we use that word test, don't oftentimes think like tests like what we do in school, right? A test is just basically a way to kind of get information, right? So of course, these are the ones you guys are familiar with, achievement tests, which help see where you're at a particular level, right? We also have aptitude tests. This is what you guys did with the SAT, some of my juniors here this year. So again, seeing what you can potentially do in the future with all of your skills that you have, right? Again, tests can be done in a group or they can be done by themselves, right? One-on-one, okay? Oftentimes, guys, we use group testing, especially with large groups. That's what you're seeing in the photo there, just because it's a lot easier to administer. Imagine if we had to pull each of you aside to do the SAT one-on-one. It would take forever. We'd have to spend an entire school year just doing that, right? Okay. Again, we've talked about this before. Whatever test we're creating, whether it's an IQ test or it's a test we're going to use for diagnosing a particular psychological disorder, we have to make sure that that everything is very consistent in terms of our data. Again, if you take a test and then retake that test and get different results, then there is a lack of reliability, right? Same thing with validity. We've got to make sure that what we want to measure is what we're measuring, right? If you're coming in and you're worried that you might have an issue with anxiety, and I decide to give you a questionnaire to see if you have anxiety, I have to make sure that those questions really capture anxiety, right? So again, the reason we included this area here in cognition is just because it goes really, really well with this conversation on cognition, right? If we're going to be testing your thinking and your language and your problem solving, again, we're going to be using some sort of assessment, right? Again, please make sure, guys, the bell curve, we talked about this in the research method, so I won't bore you guys again, but do make sure that you guys know how to read this standard deviation chart, these percentile ranks. Again, you might very well have to do a problem or two on the test next week related to this. So please make sure you guys are studying that. Again, be aware. So for example, if I give you a test and the average on that test, let's say is 80, and you scored 85 and the standard deviation is 5, then that means that your 80 is here, 85 would be here, right? And if you scored an 85, that means you are literally one standard deviation above the score, right? Okay, so that's what that means, right? And then if you wanted to find out how far you were away from everyone, you could simply add up all of these percentiles and you could see just how far ahead of the rest of the group you are. All right. This last part here is just talking about whether or not you would be classified as gifted or intellectually disabled. If you're intellectually disabled, you're looking at an IQ that is below 70. And again, gifted people tend to be significantly higher. You can see that more than 145, right? That's Mr. Hopper. But anyway, that's the story. So that's really it for this particular topic. Again, make sure to see my other review video when it comes to memory. So that's all I have for you guys today. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.